Let me read something that Matt Flegenheimer wrote in the New York Times back on November 8th. He wrote, "There is probably never a bad time to be a billionaire, but this at least is an especially complicated one. Across politics, technology, and popular culture, the wisdom and purpose of the extremely wealthy is being questioned as never before."
Complicated.
Do you see this shift taking place?
Yes, and it's what was very interesting in that phrasing. I love that piece. The wisdom and purpose of these billionaires being questioned. What's so elegant in that phrase is it's questioning both the wisdom of the billionaires, as in their wisdom, but also the purpose of having billionaires as a
the purpose of having billionaires.
Society. Not just the billionaire's sense of their own purpose, but our sense of purpose in allowing fortunes like that to be amassed.
Now, notice, allowing fortunes like that to be amassed assumes that somebody needs permission from you, from society, to be amassed. Somebody in the chat, Jennifer says, is 999 million okay? Well, no, I mean, it's not just they don't want you to have whatever they consider excessive wealth. But they know they're allowing. The only reason billionaires exist is because we allow it. So freedom is not the assumption. The assumption is we're all slaves. We're all just beholden to the tribe. We're all beholden to the state. We're all beholden to society. And there are circumstances in which society allows us, leaves us free for a while, creates the conditions where some of us can become billionaires. I mean, think of the mentality that holds that. And by the way, this is the same mentality that I was discussing yesterday in the conservative economics. The conservatives have the same mentality regarding other issues, but the same kind of attitude of we know what's best, we know how society should be structured, we will allow or not allow what we think is appropriate to be done in society. And even the suspicion of billionaires is now common among Republicans, among conservatives, as well as Democrats. But the whole language is what's important here is how collectivistic it is. The assumption is, the implicit assumption in everything this guy says, and in everything the conservative nationalists and conservative economists hold, everything, is that your life does not belong to you. That the collective, the group, is what matters. The collective, the group, counts for everything. And then they, whoever they are, the people responsible for the collective, for the group, the philosopher kings of whatever time it is, they get to decide how much freedom you get, when you get it, how much wealth you can accumulate, what you can do with your life, what you can't do with your life, because your life doesn't belong to you. And remember, this is the foundation for this is in the morality of altruism. The morality of altruism says your moral purpose is to serve others. Your moral purpose is other people's well-being. You cannot, should not think of yourself. Be selfless. Well, if I'm selfless, how can my life belong to me? How can my life have any meaning? If it doesn't have meaning to me, it certainly does have any meaning to anybody else. So the whole assumption here is that your life is not yours, and therefore your only reason you accumulate anything is because society has, quote, allowed you to do so. Now somebody on Facebook says, and I'm going to use this in spite of it's not a super chat question, that's the central question to drill down to. Do they actually have their wealth because they have done something worthy of that money? I don't think that's the central question at all. But okay, but it is a question, or simply because they have exerted power. be it market power or governmental, in order to obtain it. I don't know what market power is. Market power, of course they've exerted market power to obtain it. That's the way you become a billionaire, by exerting market power. That is a positive power. There's nothing negative about market power. Rand was very clear, it is no longer capitalism when it becomes profitable for a company to send a man to Washington. But that's everybody's business model these days. Is it? Is it Bloomberg's business model to send somebody to Washington? Is that how he achieved the success? I don't think there's any evidence of that. Was it Zuckerberg? Did Facebook achieve its success because of Zuckerberg's ban in Washington? No. Zuckerberg's ban in Washington is primarily there to defend himself. Now, it's true, there are people out there, there are billionaires out there who are complete cronies, who have achieved their wealth because of cronyism, because of their man in Washington. But you have to point them out. You have to figure out who they are before you condemn all billionaires. And it's not obvious to me that Steve Jobs, Bill Gates indeed was persecuted for not having a man in Washington. That's why he was persecuted. That's why the Justice Department went after him. So, I think it's the minority of billionaires, a small minority of billionaires, that are billionaires because of government intervention. Now, it's true that given government intervention, one cannot predict what markets would have been under laissez-faire capitalism. But the world is what it is. The economy is what it is. And to the extent that you accumulate wealth in this economy without violating the rights of others, without you explicitly violating the rights of others, without lobbying, without influencing to violate the rights of others, then it's your wealth. And you show me where early on in his career Zuckerberg lobbied to violate the rights of others. You show me where Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or Larry Ellison or Sam Walton or Bloomberg used lobbying as a means to attain their wealth. Ayn Rand criticizes those businessmen who focus their attention on Washington. But indeed, these are not examples of such men. And most of the billionaires on the Forbes billionaire list are not cronies. I mean, I'm open to being proven wrong. Now, it's also true, I've heard this criticism, that in a world with the Federal Reserve, a lot of stuff is distorted. That we don't know what the world would be if we had laissez-faire capitalism, no Federal Reserve, no quantitative easing, no printing of monies, whether there would be billionaires. Maybe there wouldn't be billionaires because the purchasing power of the dollar would be so much more powerful. You wouldn't have to be a billionaire to be as rich as a billionaire. I don't know. But again, it's not the world we live in. You have to give moral and economic credit where moral and economic credit is due. When people create value and become billionaires because of the value they create, even though the market is distorted, it's not their fault the market is distorted. It's not them who distorted the market. And it's a massive, massive injustice to lump all billionaires in as cronies, which is exactly what Bernie Sanders does. It's exactly what the left does. There's a fundamental difference between market power, which is economic power, which is limited by your voluntary interactions with other people and their voluntary consent, and government power, which is fundamentally a gun. It's a gun at the back of somebody's head. It's violence, it's coercion, it's authority. So, government power is the power to coerce, the power to force. market power is not power. Not power in the sense of coercion. It is your ability to offer a product that people can voluntarily consume or not. That people can voluntarily come and work for you or not. That people can voluntarily finance or not. Economic power is fundamentally moral because it is based on choice. It is based on voluntary exchange, on voluntary trade. That is not true with government power. Government power is about coercion. Sometimes you need coercion. In self-defense, you need force. But that's the only context in which you need force. Force should only be used in self-defense. Okay, let's keep going. Yeah, I mean, Daniel writes, for Rand's complete explanation of distinctions between capitalist businessmen and the crony capitalist businessmen. See the comparison between Hank Rearden and Arnold Boyle and Atlas Shrugged. Absolutely. But the idea that there are no Hank Reardens today because we don't have capitalism today is absurd in my view. The idea that all businessmen today are Arnold Boyles is absurd. There is no evidence of that. Now, it's true that the bigger the government is, the more involved it is, the more it regulates, the more involved in government all businessmen become. I mean, even Hank Rearden, if you remember, had his man in Washington, a man who stabbed him in the back and betrayed him in the end, as must happen to the successful capitalist businessman. But you can't survive without a man in Washington. Again, see Microsoft as an example for a company that had nobody in Washington and was therefore gone after by the Justice Department and almost completely destroyed. All right, we'll keep going with Anand.
As a priority, before we take care of priorities like making sure most people have the rudiments of a decent life.
So again, society, government, all of us, the collective, the tribe, is responsible that everybody in society have the rudiments of life, or the rudiments of the basics of life.
And over the last 30 to 40 years in the United States, we have practiced a social model that is billionaire-friendly first.
That is pretty funny. Over the last 30, 40 years, we have lived under a ever-growing regulatory state, ever-increasing, not ever-increasing because it fluctuates, but an increasingly progressive tax system, more progressive in the United States than in egalitarian Europe. Right? And yet, yeah, because we left a few industries free, primarily technology, because we left them free of regulations, free of control, and partially because we left, because we left them free. Yeah, we've had a lot of billionaires. But the idea that we have somehow, the collective, the government, has created billionaires or created an environment that's pro-billionaires is absurd. Indeed, it's an environment that's anti-billionaires. It makes it difficult for them to raise capital. It taxes them at every opportunity. It regulates their businesses. It makes it difficult, since Sarbanes-Oxley, to go public, to raise capital on a large scale. So the idea that somehow we live in some laissez-faire capitalist heaven in which, oh yeah, you can make as much money as you want, nobody steps in your way, is just insane. Indeed, in laissez-faire capitalism, from the perspective of a real purchasing power of a dollar, there would be many more billionaires, not fewer. Now, maybe they wouldn't be billionaires because the dollar would be a lot stronger, a lot more meaningful. But from the perspective of wealth, There would be many, many more wealthy people because the barriers to creating wealth would be far, far less than they are today. So this nutty assumption that since Ronald Reagan, we have done nothing but create a laissez-faire, pro-capitalist environment in which billionaires can just become billionaires is indeed insane. Okay, somebody says, somebody asked for an example of a crony billionaire. I'm trying to think. Well, I'm Donald Trump, if he's a billionaire. People who have used and manipulated the government, have lobbied for particular laws, have lobbied and used on a large-scale eminent domain. Putin in Russia, but I'm sure there are a lot in the United States. I mean, Elon Musk didn't become a billionaire out of cronyism, but is certainly sustaining himself and grown his billions out of cronyism. I mean, Tesla is one big crony company. It could have never got started. It could have never survived. It could have never thrived without massive government subsidies. Not just tax breaks for people who buy the product, but massive direct subsidies, for example, from the state of California, that in some years were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Other cronies who are billionaires, I don't have the list of billionaires in front of me, but I don't think there are that many. I don't think there are that many. I think most of the people who actually become billionaires make it on their own, make it by their own work. I mean, I know a billionaire. I know that one of the founders of what's it called? Groupon, right? The coupon thing. I mean, he's a billionaire. He's like founded 5 or 6 or 7 different companies in different spaces, all related to technology, either sold them or taken them public, and he's made well over $1 billion for himself. There's no cronyism there. I don't know. Let me go and do some research and find you crony billionaires. But Elon Musk certainly, in his second life post PayPal, has been a real crony.
Allow people to run companies in ways that make as much money as possible by cutting every social corner imaginable.
Imagine running a company to make as much money as possible, cutting social corners. What does that even mean?
Pay people as little as possible.
Okay, so they pay people as low as possible. When is that ever been a policy of American business? Pay them as low as possible. So why don't they go and work for somebody else? I mean, why isn't there competition for labor? There are plenty of employers out there. How does that work? And if you pay people as low as possible, then are they less motivated to work? Do they become less productive? I mean, the whole idea that businessmen are just scheming to lower workers' wages and oppress them and hold them down rather than increase their productivity and increase their motivation is so absurd and ludicrous that only an intellectual could hold that view, somebody who's never been in business.
As taxes as possible. Use Caribbean islands to dodge things. Use trusts. Double Irish for the Dutch sandwich tax maneuver. Not that delicious. And so on and so forth. Lobby in Washington for public policies. Bottle service public policy that's just good for you and your friends, not good for the commons. And then what you get is a defanged government.
So again, you associate all cronies, all billionaires with cronyism. They're all there lobbying for favors, all of them. And that's how it became.
Not able to do big things for people. Multiplying social problems because of that defanged government and because of all the ways you're employing people, et cetera. And then billionaires coming along and CEOs and others coming along and saying, what a shame. What a shame. These festering social problems makes my heart hurt. And this government Not able to solve it? That's a shame. Let me step up. I can fix it.
Yeah, one of the things he really hates, and his book is about, is the idea of billionaire philanthropy. He hates the idea of billionaire philanthropy. Who are they? Who are they to try to solve social problems? What we should do is tax the hell out of them, take their billions away from them, give it to the government, and let the government solve the problems. So he is very, very opposed to billionaire free market philanthropy. He wants all that money to go to government. That is part of what he hates about billionaires, is their arrogance and thinking that they can solve social problems. Who are they? Politicians. That's their job. It's politicians' job. And intellectuals like his job to solve social problems, not billionaires. Stay away, billionaires. We don't want your money, billionaires.
Talking, though, about the 1% ever since the Great Recession broke. So why do you think there's anything particularly different right now?
I think, well, first of all, movements take time to build, right? There were Seattle protests in 1999. Occupy was in
building for a
2011.
long time.
I think the financial crisis in 2008, 2009 had an enormous role in shattering not only opportunity, particularly for a lot of young people whose lives never were able to get off the ground then or since, but also shattering a certain mythology that the United States has practiced but also preached around the world. The mythology that the best society is achieved by leaving entrepreneurs alone.
That's the mythology. The best society achieved by leaving entrepreneurs alone. Now, do we leave entrepreneurs alone? Do we not demand they get licensed? Do we not demand that they pay huge taxes? Do we not regulate, again, every aspect of what they do? Where do we leave them actually alone?
That if you do that one thing, all other good things flow.
Nobody believes that if you do just one thing, all else good things flow. But he believes the world is a zero-sum game. We'll see.
So it doesn't sound like a terribly dumb idea. You know, if you let the best and the brightest and the smartest go out and do their thing, we'll have a better society.
Yeah, we would.
On the face of it.
Entrepreneurs are just one type of person in society pursuing one type of good, which is...
Yeah, and we should leave everybody free to pursue their lives. Not just one type, absolutely. But you want everybody shackled. In the name of what exactly?
Money and growth. You know, it turns out that what teachers do is not motivated by that kind of calculation, and actually turns out to be really, really important.
What is the calculation that we're talking about that entrepreneurs? I mean, he assumes that what motivates entrepreneurs, or what drives entrepreneurs, that the only thing that matters to entrepreneurs is money. But we know that that's not true. We know that's not true.
To a civilized society. I'm sure someone as intelligent as you could make more money doing a whole bunch of things in this society, but you do what you do because the pursuit of the truth. And
that's because he's free to do so.
Is a really important part of society. If we abandoned, if people who went into medicine, if people who went into public service, if we abandoned all of that because we just said, you know, the pursuit of money is a great end goal, I think we'd have a very impoverished society. And part of what has happened in the United States, and to varying degrees in other places, is as money became the lodestar,
Has money become the lodestar? Are there no more doctors? Are the smartest people in the world all going and becoming entrepreneurs? Really? I mean, it's such a BS story. It's such a nonsensical straw man that he is creating.
It became more than just the economy. It became the culture, to the point that in dating in America, people talk about optimization. Right? People use corporate jargon to discuss personal life. There's nothing that's beyond the realm of this kind of business thinking. And I wrote the book to question the idea that the very people who prosecuted this business revolution, this leave entrepreneurs alone revolution, can now miraculously reinvent themselves as the solution to the problems they have caused.
No, I appreciate that, but I do want to know how far you would go to Well, let me put it this way. Bernie Sanders says billionaires should not exist. You prepared to go that far?
I think he's right.
That billionaires should not exist. These guys get to decide.
And I would say this. We have tried the other way for a while.
Which is leave them alone to do anything.
But we don't leave them alone to do everything.
Having billionaires. We've tried the having billionaires approach. And it turns out in the United States to be pretty inconsistent with the flourishing of most people.
Now, is that true? Is that really true that most people are hampered or worse off because there are some billionaires? I mean, I don't know. Are people worse off because the financial world is more efficient and more productive because of Bloomberg terminals and Bloomberg data? Is everybody worse off because of the iPhone or because of Google or because of Microsoft or because we have now computers on every desk as Bill Gates imagined it? Or that we have iPads or that we have Harry Potter? Because don't forget, J.K. Rowling is a billionaire. Are we really, is that the problem in America? That we have too many billionaires? We have too many creators of wealth? Have created too many products? Is that impoverishing us? Is that limiting our opportunities, the rest of us, those of us who are not billionaires? Do we have fewer opportunities because we are billionaires? Or do we indeed have more opportunities because of billionaires? Is our quality of life and our standard of living actually increased significantly because of the existence of these billionaires? It is, again, striking to me how they don't think this through or they don't want to address this at all. At all.
So I'm intellectually honest enough to say, let's try another approach.
Well, intellectually honest is not something I would attribute to Anand.
Which is having a tax code and regulatory structure that would make it, impossible or at least much harder to become a billionaire. And let's see what we get. If after 10 or 15 years of that, it turns out that's counterproductive and bad for most people, I'd be happy to come back on this show and advocate for the reinstatement of billionaires.
And who gets to decide these things? Who gets to make the decision about what social programs we can put in place to get rid of billionaires, how long we should wait, when we think the decision has shifted, how we measure human well-being, how we measure who's flourishing, when's the flourishing happening, where is the flourishing, how do we measure the benefits to some and the costs to others? Where's this utility, magical, social, good, social utility function that we get to adjust and play around with? And we'll regulate here and we'll see how it affects the utility function. And if things get better, then we'll really. This is complete and utter gibberish, but it's complete and utter gibberish that all collectivists suffer from, because all collectivists think in terms of what's good for the group, and they can't measure that. They don't know what's good for the group. They have no measure of goodness for the group. So they're left with their own opinion. They're left with what they feel like. They're left with their own little statistics, what they prefer as a measure of quality of human life. And therefore, all this is the nuns of the world gaining power, having levers over people's lives, changing it. Let's have some flourishing over there, and let's deny flourishing over here. To hell with billionaires' lives. Well, destroy them. We don't want Bezos to go to Mars. To hell with that project. It's not a good project when there are people over here. There are people over here. There is no, somebody says infant mortality is a good measure. No, it's not. How many people are you willing to kill, sacrifice, in the human sacrifice game in order to reduce infant mortality by how many points? Death of despair. Why are they dying of despair? Because of billionaires? Because of billionaires? There is no measure of overall societal well-being, because my well-being, I'm not going to die of despair. My children are not going to die at childbirth when they're infants. This guy says, how does Yaron Brook explain the success of Sweden and Denmark? Checkmate. Really? I have done videos and videos and videos explaining the moderate success of Sweden and Denmark. So you'd think he just came up with it. It's the first person who's ever asked me about Sweden and Denmark. I get that question in every talk that I do, and I do about 100 a year. So give me a break. Checkmate. I just find it's funny. He said checkmate. That's the antagonism, not me. No, I don't think there is a measure of well-being. The measure of well-being is freedom. The measure of well-being is people have the opportunities to live well. And when they are free, I mean, we know what happens with freedom. Standard of living goes up, child mortality goes down. I mean, if child mortality is high in the United States, which it is relative to Europe, we should ask questions about why. And a lot of that has to do with certain populations, but it doesn't have to do with all of us. It has to do with drugs, it has to do with lifestyle choices, and it has to do with the welfare state out of control. And notice that the more we spend on welfare, the more deaths of despair there are. And by the way, I've done a whole show on deaths of despair, and they have a lot to do with lack of freedom, lack of choices, but primarily with lack of personal responsibility. People not taking personal responsibility. People not going out there and investing in themselves. People not taking their own lives seriously. It does not have anything to do with capitalism. It does not have anything to do with billionaires. And it has everything to do with the welfare state. With the state that teaches people not to take care of themselves. Teaches people to sit around on their hands waiting for jobs. Teaches people to sit around waiting for other people to take care of them. And when they don't, they feel despair. So, I would argue that the deaths of despair have increased dramatically as government has grown dramatically, as the role of government has come to dominate our lives, as the number of government employees has exploded, as the amount of dollars the government spend has exploded, as the amount of regulation has exploded, as businesses has been limited, as business has been constrained, as opportunities have been limited, we get more deaths of despair. Statism causes despair. Freedom does not. You do not get deaths of despair in the periods in which America had free markets. So, this idea that you can measure societal well-being in some way by some one measure, and therefore that it's okay to sacrifice some to others in order to increase that measure, improve that measure, is again pure collectivism, disregard for individual liberty, individual freedom, individual rights, and a recipe for disaster. And I don't think that all this is increasing. Somebody says it's correlated with the number of billionaires. It's not. Because if you take the purchasing power of the dollar, there were a lot of rich people 100 years ago, maybe as many as there are today. Indeed, by Thomas Piketty's calculation, inequality today is about the same as it was in the late 19th century. And there were no deaths of despair in the late 19th century. So the correlation doesn't hold. Deaths of despair, and if you go back to Sweden when it was socialist in the 1970s and the 1980s, Sweden had massive numbers of deaths of despair. Massive amount of suicide. I would argue that it is socialism. It is a culture where people expect to make their living off of other people, where they expect government to come in and bail them out. That is the culture of death. That is the culture of despair. And that inculcates that culture. So if you want to do just correlations. No. Hong Kong, you don't get a lot of deaths of despair in Hong Kong when Hong Kong was free. You didn't get a lot of deaths of despair in the United States. Indeed, even in the Great Depression, when the economy had crushed and plummeted, when people were truly in desperate conditions, there was not a huge spike in suicides. There was not a huge spike in what's called deaths of despair. Because even during the Depression, people believed in their own capability to take care of themselves. They believed that they had personal responsibility over their own lives. They didn't sit on their hands waiting for the government to give them favors. So what is rotting away at American society today is not billionaires. And you can again measure wealth. What's his name? Rockefeller was far wealthier than Bezos in real dollars. It's not freedom. It's not technology. It's not billionaires. It's a culture that is telling them they are worthless. It's a culture that is telling them they're not responsible for their own life. Just sit around and wait and other people will help you. The government will save you. It is a culture that talks about collectives and talks about collective goods and ignores and abandons the individual. There has been no increase, significant increase, in freedom in the United States over the last 40 years. Slight increase under Reagan when there was deregulation in the late 70s and early 80s. And since then, just a steady increase in more and more and more and more and more controls and regulations at the local, at the state, at the federal level. All right, let's do a little bit more of Anand, and then we'll go to your Super Chat questions. There's a lot of Super Chat questions on billionaires.
But I think we should talk about the myth that has upheld the idea that it's good to have billionaires. The myth is that what's good for them is good for everybody else.
But it is. If the billionaires become billionaires from production, then it is good for everybody else.
Right? It's the win-win ideology.
It's not a win-win ideology. It's a basic tenet of trade, of economics, of human relationships, that voluntary trade is win-win.
I think people are starting to not believe it in droves.
That's
but it
true.
has been a defining myth.
People don't believe it anymore. And Donald Trump doesn't believe it. The left doesn't believe it. Everybody in between doesn't believe it. And it's the end of capitalism and the end of freedom when you stop believing in the trader principle. Ayn Rand called it the trader principle, the idea that voluntary exchange, rationally done, is beneficial to both parties, and people should be free to engage in that. Once the belief in that disappears, markets will disappear, capitalism disappears, freedom disappears.
It's 40
and that's
years.
where we're heading.
And at the heart of the myth is this idea that if you just have business flourish, you have these people do whatever they want to do, everybody's welfare will increase. And I think what people are...
That's right. But of course, not everybody's welfare, those people who are willing to work and be productive. But again, that's myth, he calls it, is under conditions of freedom. And we don't have those conditions of freedom today.
Not to. And my own attempt to intervene in that discussion is to say, in certain moments in history, people are not down below because they have failed to join the people up above. They're down below because people up above are standing on their necks.
Or the government is standing on their necks with licensing laws and taxes that reduce employment and all kinds of ways in which productivity is suppressed, minimum wages. You could go on and on and on with the ways in which government stands on people's necks. Oh, providing a horrible educational system in which people stand on the necks of those who can't rise. Not billionaires. Billionaires are not standing on anybody's necks. Again, the equivocation of economic power with political power. It is government that's standing on people's necks.
And when you are in a situation like that in a society, the only solution to lifting people up is to actually stop people standing on their necks.
Yes,
and
I
that's
agree
not
with
going to
that.
happen with them
Have to stop the government from doing
voluntarily
that.
signing statements to have better behaved business. It's not going to happen through them giving one pair of shoes for every pair of shoes they sell to you. It's not going to happen through impact investing, where you also factor in social returns. It's not going to happen through social enterprise or philanthropy. It's going to happen the old-fashioned way, which is democratically.
How are we going to, if we stand on the billionaires' necks, which is what he's proposing, how does that take the foot off of the poor people's necks?
Just
he
putting
never
business in
explains
a
that.
proper place in society through regulation, taxation, and
Force,
policies
coercion.
and laws.
Is it immoral to be a billionaire?
I was called to the Oxford Union to engage in a debate about that.
This is
And,
really
the Oxford
good.
Union, I was told, is sort of famous for framing these debates in a way that favors the kind of conservative landed gentry side of the argument, because it is the Oxford Union. So I was, asked to argue this "it's immoral to be a billionaire" position, and I argued that it is. It's probably a touch more strenuous claim than I would make. I think it's immoral for a society that allows there to be billionaires, as Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio.
He quotes AOC, but it's immoral for us not to exert force and coercion on billionaires in order to prevent them from being billionaires. That's the immorality. But he also goes on and says billionaires
when
are
asked
immoral.
that same question. But the reason I argued it is immoral to be a billionaire, it may be immoral to be a billionaire, is that if you are the beneficiary of a system that predictably, reliably, foreseeably favors your continued hoarding of resources, while most people are not
Hoarding of
able to have the
resources.
rudiments of a deep.
Hoarding of resources. I mean, this comes up over and over and over again. And as much, I've explained it a million times why the rich don't hoard. There is no hoarding of resources. There's investment. There's savings. There's no hoarding. Where do they...
Life. And if you are not doing everything in your power to dismantle that system that you're standing on top of, you become complicit in that system. It doesn't mean that everybody who is a billionaire is the same level of sinner. It doesn't mean that everybody's committed fraud to become a billionaire.
Not everybody, just some of them, a significant amount. It would be good if you had some evidence to suggest that some of them have committed fraud to become billionaires.
A whole bunch of stories.
But imply it.
Right? And the wealth of the Sackler family, members of which are behind the opioid crisis in the United States, is really, really different from the wealth of Serena Williams, who's just really good at tennis. But both benefit.
Note that athletes always get a pass. Athletes always get a pass. Athletes, it's fine if they're rich. It's business people who are hated. It's producers that are hated. Athletes, actors, they're fine.
From a set of societal arrangements that favor them in a way that I think if you are a responsible citizen, you have to spend your time fighting against.
So basically, he is, as he says, he's an altruist. And basically he's saying billionaires are immoral because they don't fight against their interests. Billionaires are immoral because they don't actually spend their money to make sure that there are no billionaires, that the money's not taken away from them. Billionaires are immoral because they don't use their lobbying power to basically eviscerate their own businesses and eviscerate their own wealth. That's what makes billionaires immoral. That's altruism. Billionaires are immoral because they don't hurt themselves. Billionaires are immoral because they're too self-interested. And that's what you expect from a culture that is becoming more and more altruistic, more and more collectivistic. That's where we're heading. That's what's going to that's a direction, left and right. There's no disagreement anymore. It's just what kind of collective, which collective you want to die for. And altruism is the underlying, unquestioned, unchallenged, indisputable moral framework for every single one of these people.
Can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute, that man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it, and that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith.
On faith.
Not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason, a morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
Using the super chat, and I noticed yesterday when I appealed for support for the show, many of you stepped forward and actually supported the show for the first time. So I'll do it again. Maybe we'll get some more today. If you like what you're hearing, if you appreciate what I'm doing, then I appreciate your support. Those of you who don't yet support the show, please take this opportunity. Go to yaronbrookshow.com/support or go to subscribestar.com, Yaron Brook Show, and make a kind of a monthly contribution to keep this going. I'm not sure when the next